At the University of Toledo, we are surrounded by experts. And we tap into those experts here on Rocket Talk.
Most school-aged children are back in class after semesters of virtual or hybrid learning due to the pandemic. But some people didn't return. And we're not talking about students here, but teachers, subs, and support staff. People needed to keep the schools operational. That's happening across the country, and our area is no exception. The standards for subs were lowered across Ohio, and a talent recruiter for Toledo Public Schools told 13ABC they've even reached out to parents to see if they'd be willing to fill in those gaps. Local media reports indicate a number of area school board members are open to bringing in subs without college degrees. Now, this comes as already overworked teachers, administrators, and staff are skipping their lunch breaks and planning periods just to sub in someone else's classroom. Now, the pandemic and the so-called Great Resignation are partially to blame, but our guests today say there's a lot more to this story. Now, they both spent years in the classroom before becoming researchers at UToledo's College of Education. Dr. Natasha Hillsman Johnson is an assistant professor of science education. She taught K through 12 science before, and now the goal of her scholarship is to increase interest, access, and achievement in the sciences for all students with an emphasis on equity, social justice, and amplifying marginalized voices. And Department Chair Dr. Edward Janak taught high school for almost a decade before becoming a scholar and author. He researches the intersection of general education board funding and historically marginalized populations. He's also examining the role of pop culture texts as both informal and formal education media. Thanks to both of you for being here. Impressive research, great goals that we have here. But I would say if most educators heard this right now, they would say we have an urgent problem, and that's just getting adults to come to school, to drive the buses, to serve lunch, and to fill in as subs. So, Dr. Janak, let me start with you. How in the world did we get here?
Well, it actually goes back over 100 years to talk about the origins of this. Back in the mid-1800s, teaching, which used to be a relatively masculinized profession, became highly feminized. And what that meant was that, number one, salaries plummeted. You were able to pay women literally pennies on the dollar at that time. But also respect for the profession plummeted through that time. And that was a trend that we still see today, the groundwork for which was laid, again, over 100 years ago. By the time the 1980s rolled around, you had the Reagan administration that released the report A Nation at Risk, which really attacked the American public schools for the first time with some really alarmist rhetoric. And it began a sense of teacher scapegoating. At around about that same time, you had the culture wars in the United States, and schools became one of the primary battlegrounds of these culture wars, which again, teachers were kind of caught in the crosshairs. And it left them with somewhat of a lack of autonomy in what they could teach, as they had political forces on both sides really trying to have huge impact in their curriculum. And then, of course, in the 90s, the rhetoric around teacher scapegoating really began to amplify all the way through the No Child Left Behind passage. And then you see films that were coming out, the pseudo-documentaries that were scapegoating America's public schools. And then if you think about the conditions in the public schools today, and just quite frankly, what is involved in being a teacher today, even pre-pandemic, we saw the rise in incidents of school violence, which is making a lot of teachers begin to have to think about themselves not only as an educator, but as a first responder. And then, of course, as you mentioned, the pandemic hitting, and a lot of teachers were having to teach in multimodality simultaneously, which is challenging for anybody, let alone when you're trying to get a group of 5-year-olds, 3 of which are physically present with you and 10 of which are in the field with their parents monitoring what's going on. And then you couple it with there's a huge nationwide plummet in students wanting to become teachers today. Over the past, and again, this is pre-pandemic as well, we've seen up to a 65% reduction in the enrollment in colleges of education nationwide. What a lot of that comes down to is back to that salary issue that I started this off with. Today, a lot of people look at a college education in terms of return on investment. So my degree is going to cost me this amount of money. What am I getting for it? And teaching, as one of the lowest paid professions with one of the highest standards out there, is just not drawing people in. Even people who would be amazingly good teachers just say, why am I going to go $400,000 into debt for a job that's going to pay me $40,000 a year?
So you're saying the problem started long before the pandemic?
Absolutely.
Dr. Johnson, I know you taught high school in Georgia for 20 years. You probably still have educator friends back there, and I know you have school-age children here and there as well. What are you hearing? How is morale in the classroom?
Morale, as Dr. Janak said, morale is at probably an all-time low. As he said, I was teaching when the pandemic started. So that was my last year of K-12, and what is being asked of teachers is basically to do not just one job for a low salary, but actually two, because prior to completing my PhD, I actually taught for Georgia Virtual School for 10 years. And I was asked to teach physics, but the only thing I was asked to do was facilitate the course. I did live sessions and I helped students who needed help, but I didn't actually have to develop content. That was someone else's responsibility. But through the pandemic, now you have teachers who are being asked to physically be in place to teach face-to-face, but then also be responsible for a learning management system where they're creating videos and content for students to use. So the pressures are just so much greater than they have been. And I actually was having a conversation with my students, I think 2 weeks ago, about the substitute shortage, because they're student teachers right now. And I actually reached out to Dr. Welch and I said, can I substitute? Because it's so hard when you have such a hectic day, when you're trying to meet the needs of your students, respond to parent communication, interact with your colleagues, and just things like eating lunch, getting to the restroom become challenges. Sometimes you need that planning period just to sometimes it's just for mental health, you just need that downtime where you're not having to interact with anyone. And the thought of teachers on a regular basis arriving at school and being told they're not going to have planning because a faculty is being quarantined, or maybe their child is under quarantine and they can't come to work, it has to just kind of take its toll. So it's a huge concern.
How do you think it's impacting the students?
I think it's affecting the students tremendously, because the teacher is the heart of the classroom, and when your teacher is not at their best, the students are always going to suffer. I think that it is affecting the quality of instruction, the time that teachers have to create, high quality, lessons for students. So if your teacher's not fully prepared and engaged and, rested, that comes through in your teaching. I was fortunate enough, about 7 years ago, I was teaching part-time while I was working on my PhD. And because I was a high school educator, I taught like Monday, Wednesday, and every other Friday. And my students could tell the difference. And they would say, listen, we know you weren't here yesterday, but could you stop coming in all like happy and excited? But I felt like it really helped the quality of my teaching when I stepped back and asked for a part-time position instead of a full-time position.
So Dr. Janak, what have local school board members and lawmakers tried to do to fix this problem? And has it worked? And what should we be doing?
Clearly not enough, to be very honest. One of the biggest things, and you're starting to see this in some of the other professions, which is we got to raise the salaries. And it's not just teaching. We're seeing this nationwide. We keep talking about a worker shortage when we realize it's not a worker shortage. It's a shortage of people willing to work for the salary under the conditions. And teaching is part and parcel of that. So that's one of the biggest ones, is we have to start incentivizing the profession. Second thing is we have to start looking at ways to incentivize students to come into the teaching profession. I just had an article forwarded to me the other day where they are doing a new scholarship program in nursing at Mercy College down the road because of the nursing shortage right now. So they're finding ways to help offset the first year costs for people to go on and become nurses. Teaching should be operating like that. Part of why I was able to do my advanced degrees was at the University of South Carolina. As a working teacher, I got a really substantive reduction in tuition. So the teachers should also be getting some kind of rewards more education not only is a requirement to stay in the field, but it's also a good way for renewal and to help avoid the burnout, as Dr. Johnson was talking about. So finding ways that we can get teachers these kinds of support as well would be really, really beneficial.
Yeah, so along those lines, what is UToledo doing to try to recruit those aspiring teachers? And how is enrollment in your department?
And Dr. Johnson will be able to speak from a teacher education point of view more. My department's a little more graduate oriented. College of Education is, like many colleges of education nationwide, our enrollment is dropping. One of the great programs that we do have, though, and a direct attempt to address this teacher shortage, is called LAMP, where people who have a degree that didn't necessarily want to become a teacher can come back, do an intensive year on campus, and then they're fully licensed and have a master's degree. So Dr. Johnson, are there any other things that you'd like to mention?
We've only got about 30 seconds left.
Oh, absolutely. I would like to see more experiences in other colleges with school-age children, because people tend to run from education majors and fields. People fall into teaching. So I think the more you can create opportunities for science majors, math majors, engineering students, students in social sciences to have experiences in classrooms and working with young children, you're going to create more opportunity for them to really understand what teaching is and how rewarding it can be.
Okay, well, thanks so much for both of you for coming on this program. Thanks to you at home for watching. That's all the time we have. We'll see you next time with more Rocket Talk from the University of Toledo.